This is the Tower Hamlets and City London Cemetery. It opened in 1841 and is one of the so-called Magnificent Seven cemeteries in London. The others being Highgate, Brompton, West Norwood, Kensal Green, Abney Park and Nunhead. It closed the burials in 1966, and there's something that is over 300,000 burials here. It was turned into over to the council, and they tried to redevelop it in 67, and lots of the graves were knocked down, particularly in the southern part of the cemetery. There was an outcry, they stopped doing it, and instead it was eventually opened up as a nature reserve in 2000, and there's a Friends of Tower Hamlets Cemetery which look after it. All these cemeteries, these so-called Magnificent Seven cemeteries, were opened up on the outskirts of what was the main built-up area. We're slightly on the outskirts of the East End here, of what the East End was in 1841. The cemetery comprised 27 acres. It was bombed quite heavily during the war, and when they were going to turn it into a park and they started knocking the graves down, they demolished. There was an established Church of England chapel here, a small nonconformist chapel. There was a mortuary even, and a building at the main entrance. They were all demolished, and the place was turned into a bit of a shambles. Local kids used it to ride their bikes and play. It's a playground. Winos would come in and drink their special brew. But I'll show you on the map here where it is. This is the area where the Jack the Ripper murders took place, Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and the cemetery is way out here. This was the outskirts, this is slightly after the Jack the Ripper period. This is very much the outskirts of London, particularly when the cemetery was built in 1841. Interestingly, none of the Jack the Ripper victims, although this is the main cemetery for the East End, none of the Jack the Ripper victims were buried here. And as far as I'm aware, none of the other Whitechapel murders victims were buried here either. But there are a number of interesting Jack the Ripper connections with the Tower Hamlets Cemetery. I have with me here my specially made, very detailed map of all the graves in Tower Hamlets Cemetery. We're in the southern bit here, which is the bit that was demolished, which is roughly this area. We're around this area here. All these graves in this part here were pulled up, as I mentioned to you earlier. Over here is the mortuary. Here is the establishment Church of England church. There's the small nonconformist chapel. And over here is the entrance. This is still the main entrance today. I'm going to show you first of all the most well-known grave in Tower Hamlets Cemetery. It's for Dr. Rees Llewellyn, the doctor who found, or who did the autopsy and the first medical examination of Mary Ann Polly Nichols in 1888. His grave is over in this area here. So you come in the entrance and you find it around here. And I'm going to show you that right now. Probably the reason why Dr. Llewellyn's grave is the most well-known of the Jack the Ripper related graves in Tower Hamlets Cemetery is it's right close to the main entrance. And I'll show you where it is. Dr. Rees Llewellyn's surgery was on Whitechapel Road, just around the corner from where Polly Nichols was murdered on Bucks Row on the 31st of August 1888. At about 4 a.m, PC Thane knocked on his door to get the doctor to come and inspect the body. Llewellyn dressed and probably arrived at about 4:10 a.m. to formally confirm that a death had occurred and estimated that Polly had been dead for about half an hour. He didn't notice the abdominal wounds as they had been covered up by the perpetrator. The body was taken to the Whitechapel mortuary, and the extent of Polly's injuries became apparent. Dr. Llewellyn was sent for again to re-examine the body. Later still, at 10 a.m, he performed a full post-mortem examination. Interestingly, Dr. Llewellyn believed that the abdominal wounds had been committed first, before the throat wounds had been perpetrated on the body. Now, this is the family vault of Dr. Llewellyn's entire family. It can fit 12 people. The first body was buried here in 1854, the last, I believe, in 1927. Dr. Llewellyn himself in 1921. As we can see, he's a physician and surgeon. His father was also a doctor, MD. That's his mother, and that's one of his sisters. If we come round here, this is the first body that was buried here, a young sister of Dr. Llewellyn's, who died in 1854 and was only 14 months old. And there was five other young children of Llewellyn, Dr. Llewellyn, Dr. Rees Llewellyn's father, who died in infancy. That's what it was like in Victorian times. They were a medical family, and his other brother, Walter, here, was also a surgeon. And there's another, that's Dr. Llewellyn's brother, Geoffrey Llewellyn, and there's another one there. So I think there are 11 bodies in here. They could have had 12, but there's 11. The next grave I'm going to show you isn't directly related to the Jack Ripple murders, although in my opinion it is, and that's of Charles Jamrack, who had a menagerie. He had a famous emporium on the highway, Ratcliffe Highway, as what then was St George's Highway as it became, where he provided exotic animals from around the world. And they had a famous incident where a tiger escaped in 1857 and nearly killed a young boy. And it probably traumatised other children who lived in that area around Bett Street, where it happened off the highway. So anyone living in that area may have been traumatised by this tiger incident. Jamrack is buried here, and we'll have a look at that next. So, from the grave of Dr. Llewellyn, I'll show you how you can find the grave of Charles Jamrack. It's down in this direction. Again, Charles Jamrack was a well-known person, and so his grave is quite easy to find, and it features on most of the tours of this cemetery. He was wealthy, and he paid for a private grave on a prominent location by one of the main paths, which we'll see in a moment, which again is why it's easy to find. He was known as Charles Jamrack, but his full name was Johann Christian Karl Jamrack. He was born in Germany and moved to London in about 1840 and became the leading importer of exotic animals. They came to London from all around the world via the docks. His business was on the highway and was known as Jamrack's Menagerie, and you could get tigers, lions, giraffes, zebras, snakes, all sorts of exotic birds, anything pretty much you could get there. The family of the boy who was attacked by the tiger were awarded £300 in damages, which was a large sum in those days, and Jamrack himself died in 1891. Interestingly, Charles Lechmere's mother ran a cat food dealership almost exactly opposite Jamrack's menagerie. Charles Lechmere himself was brought up around that same area, which was known as Tiger Bay, and I wonder if the tiger incident influenced that name. It was known as the worst haunt of violent and aggressive prostitutes that serviced the dockside seafaring community. At the time of the tiger incident, Charles Lechmere had just had his 8th birthday. And another interesting connection, the tiger escaped from Jamrack's warehouse, which was on a road called Bett Street, and some years later Charles Lechmere's children went to Bett Street School, which was built on the site of Jamrack's warehouse. The next grave which I'm going to show you is that of PC Ernest Thompson, who is the policeman who found the dead body of the Whitechapel murder victim Francis Coles in 1891, and he's buried here. From the Jamrack grave, we're going to find the grave of Ernest Thompson. Now, this is quite a difficult one to find, and particularly on a very hot day like today. Now, Ernest Thompson is also buried in a private grave alongside two other policemen. James Barber, who died in 1885, he fell through a skylight while pursuing a suspect, and William Pasca, who died in 1890 in Margate. He drowned while off duty trying to save someone. It was originally very close to the Church of England chapel that was close to where I am now, actually. The grave had been paid for by the Metropolitan Police as Thompson had died in the line of duty. In December 1900, Thompson was stabbed to death while on his beat by someone called Barnet Abrahams, just off Commercial Road. He died in a cab while on his way to the London Hospital. The main artery of his neck had been severed. Abrahams were given 20 years penal servitude for manslaughter rather than murder, and as we can see, it's getting quite difficult walking through this now. On the 15th of December 1900, the Illustrated Police News carried a report on his funeral. In the presence of a very large gathering, the funeral of the late officer took place at Bow Cemetery. Tower Hamlets Cemetery, by the way, was also known colloquially as Bow Cemetery. The cortege left the house of the deceased officer in Princess Street, Stepney, shortly before 1 o'clock, and headed by the band of the division to which the deceased had been attached, which played the Dead March in Saul, proceeded on its melancholy journey. Behind the carriages containing the relatives and friends of the deceased, considerably over 3,000 officers and men of the Metropolitan Police followed. All along the line of the route, the streets were densely packed and with sympathetic spectators. The blinds of the houses were drawn, and in some cases the shopkeepers closed their establishments entirely whilst the procession proceeded solemnly along. At the cemetery, an impressive service was held. Hundreds of beautiful wreaths were sent to the residents, and the coffin was covered with costly emblems. Now, if we look at the grave now, it's in a very sorry state. Pete Thompson's name is there. You can just about make it out. Ernest Thompson. The other two, Barber, I can just make out. I can't make out the other one at all. I think it's about there somewhere. But it's in a very sorry state. This is the grave to those three dead Metropolitan policemen, which clearly isn't really being looked after at all now. I actually had to clear away a lot of these weeds. It was totally overgrown until I came here a few minutes ago. When P.C. Thompson found the body of Francis Coles, he was a young, new, fresh constable, and it was his first night out on the beat on his own. On the morning of the 13th of February 1891, at about 2:15 a.m, Thompson heard some footsteps going away from him. He turned into Swallow Gardens, an alleyway that led under a railway arch just off Chambers Street. Chambers Street is still there, the arch is still there. He shone his bullseye lantern and saw the body of a woman. Blood was pouring from her neck and her eyes opened and closed. So police procedure was that if you're with a body that isn't dead, that is severely injured, you should stay with it. So he couldn't pursue these footsteps, the person who he heard going off into the distance. Quite possibly Jack the Ripper, at the very least, because it depends whether you regard Francis Coles as a Jack the Ripper victim or not. Could have been Jack the Ripper or just the murderer of Francis Coles. And that's the very interesting thing about Ernest Thompson, who is in this grave now, murdered in the line of duty 9 years later. Now, the next one is, to some people, probably quite exciting. Some people know about it. The previous graves, a lot are known about, quite well known about. This one is much less known about. I first discovered the grave about 5 years ago. I kept it fairly secret. It sort of leaked out since then. So I think it's time to properly unveil it. And that's of George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Society. And his grave is here. That area over there is where the old Church of England chapel used to be. Through this gate here is where we just came. Down here is where the very awkward bit walking to find the Ernest Thompson grave. And now we're going to find George Lusk's grave, which is over in this direction. Now, George Lusk is invariably portrayed in Jack the Ripper films as a wild-eyed leader of vigilantes, a revolutionary rebel-rouser. Actually, he was a successful local businessman who ran a building company and lived in Tollet Street near Stepney Green Tube Station. His house is still there. He was in charge of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and helped to organise civilian patrols to assist the police in apprehending the culprit. He sprung to some sort of fame when on the 16th of October 1888 a letter was sent to his address that read, "From Hull, Mr. Lusk, sir. I sent you half a kidney. I took it from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." Usually people perceive an Irish accent to the way it was written and spelt, but I think a West Country, Gloucestershire or Herefordshire accent works just as well. With the letter, as indicated, was half a kidney. There are arguments over whether the kidney could have been the one removed from the body of Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square on the night of the so-called double event, Sunday morning of the 30th of September 1888. The letter with the kidney was delivered through his letterbox at his address, that house that's still there in Tollet Street. Now, his wife Susanna died in 1888 in February. Lusk himself died in 1919. They're buried in graves next to each other. We'll go and see if we can find them. Now, the grave, or both of their graves, are just down here. Just in here. There's a convenient bottle of water here. Now, Susanna, his wife Susanna, her family maiden name was Price. We'll be coming close here. Coming close. You see that there? That's where it says Price. Can you see? It's her family, and this is her name here. Can you see that Lusk there? That's actually for Susanna Lusk. The graves are next to each other. The stone for George Lusk, presuming he had a stone, would have been next to it. They were next to each other, but his stone isn't still here anymore. Now, this is just going to be our first look at Tower Hamlets Cemetery, because there are a lot more very interesting graves here. This is, after all, the house of Lechmere, and this cemetery is stuffed full of Lechmeres, and we'll be exploring further to find them. But the 4 that I've discussed today have each got Lechmere connections, which I've alluded to either directly or indirectly. And this cemetery is well worth visiting. It's always under threat. Originally, as I said, in the late 60s, the Great GLC, Great London Council, was going to turn it into a park. There are threats again even now to turn this into a park and obliterate a lot of the graves. It's sacrilege, but there are people still planning to do that now and turn over this history. There are other parks that people can use as parks around here. This is a special and rather sacred spot that should be left as untouched as possible. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share.